welcome to a new Soundbite series starting on a Monday, looking at the book of Exodus, a book with a great theme that undergirds all of its events, the presence of God among his people. So hopefully that will encourage us as we come out of testing times to fix our eyes upon him. So without further ado, let me read chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labour. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and made them work ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labour in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labour the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it's a boy, kill him, but if it's a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" And the midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but every girl live." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, a book that looks at the presence of God. But the people in chapter 1 here are not people who are even aware of God's presence. It starts, ironically, with a break in the Hebrew grammar. The first sentence begins with an and these are the names of the people, the sons of Israel. See, every relationship we have in life is undergirded by one simple, profound thing: trust. Trust is the essential that undergirds marriage, that makes a child cry out to its parent in need. It cements friendships, even though it takes a lifetime to build, can be destroyed so in an instant. Yet the most basic characteristic of all those who have known God throughout history is a trust in God. That is, a trust that what he says is true. And you build up trust as you experience a person keeping promises to you. And that's where the transformation in the book of Exodus begins. It begins with the family who trusted, stemming back to Abraham. Abraham, who was given a covenant, a promise, a binding promise from God. In Abraham 17, verses 1 to 8. It says this: "God said to Abraham, 'As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, father of many. For I have made you the father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you. And the whole land of Canaan, where you are now aliens, I will give an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God.'" So there are three things that God promised to Abraham. He would be fruitful, lots of descendants, inherit a land, and he would receive God's blessing. And Abraham had to have real guts to trust God, because he was 99 years old with a wife who was too old for children at that point. God promised he would be fruitful, and Abraham began to trust God that he would keep promises, even those that looked humanly impossible. And within the year, Isaac was born. But he never saw the promise of land fulfilled. So Isaac, his son, the living proof that God kept promises, trusted that he would keep the covenant and pass the promise on to Jacob, his son. And in chapter 28, verse 3, the same promise is repeated. And Jacob passes it on to his children, Genesis 48, verse 3. That's what made this family different. They were people who trusted that God would keep these promised to be fruitful for land and for blessing. But here's the tension at the beginning of this book. Has God's promise failed? See, God was keeping the promise to make them fruitful. In verse 6 of our reading, Joseph and all his brothers in that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. But there's no sign yet of that promise of the land being fulfilled, because the land they were filling was Egypt, not Canaan. So how far could God keep those promises in this new generation? Do you trust God even if what his promises has not yet been fulfilled? And only when you do that will you be ready to really know him, for that's what trusting him means. But for them it was even worse. The promises were unfulfilled, but there were pressures against them, against trusting God. I mean, while it might be true that when disaster strikes you find out who your real friends are, so far in trusting the promises of God, the reality of faith hasn't really come to a fore until it hits this crisis. A new king who didn't know about Joseph came to power. Verse 8, look, the Israelites have become much too numerous for them. We must deal shrewdly with them, or they'll become more numerous, and if war breaks out, they'll become our enemies. So they put slave masters over them and forced them into forced labour. There's nothing people hate more than to be among those whom God is apparently blessing. And this new Pharaoh saw the fruitfulness of the Israelites was beyond what was normal, resented them, and felt threatened by them, and so tried to enslave them unjustly to break their spirit. So verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, and so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. Now, if you're serious about trusting God, you're going to find the same experience, that actually there will be pressure put on you, because it reminds you of what matters most. You basically stick by the people that mean the most to you, like you would in your family in adversity. But actually, if you have a faith in God, it's going to be at those moments when it's tested that you'll find out how deep and real it is. So, when Pharaoh's first plan failed, he set about another one, which was just as horrible. He told the midwives, you've got to kill any male children that are born and the birthing stool before they've even taken a breath. And the midwives now become the embodiment of the people of Israel. Are they going to keep the promise of God? They're going to obey the king Pharaoh or the king who ruled them, the covenant Lord? And of course, they chose to tell Pharaoh a lie and keep by God's promise. You know, not very plausible lie really. Verse 19, Hebrew women are vigorous and give birth before we even arrive. And although it's not being commended for them lying, God honours their right behaviour with grace and blesses them with families of their own. So trusting God can be refined through testing times, because you find out how deep it really is. But how does that relationship, that knowing him, in fact begin to deepen itself? Well, the answer is through recognising the providence of God. You have the promises of God, and you have indeed the presence of God with you, the way of God to live, but it's the providence of God that we begin to see that teaches us about him as he really is. See, at each stage of this account, those who had the eyes of faith fixed on the promises of God would have seen that God was involved with his people. See, the family only have a promise of fruitfulness, and then suddenly, baby boom. And then in verse 7 it actually has 4 different ways of saying how extraordinarily fruitful they were. Fruitful, multiplied greatly, exceedingly numerous, land was filled with them. Just to get the point, God was keeping his promise in abundance. And when that was confirmed, despite the pressure and the slavery of Pharaoh, they were even more fruitful. See, God's promises can't be frustrated. So those who are looking for it could see that God was obviously at work, and that even the persecution was being used in God's providence as a catalyst. And we'll find out what for, because it's going to keep the second promise, the promise of inheriting the land. But in the process, the way God rescued them from this slavery became the clearest visual aid of all of how God would save all of his people through his son Jesus. But spoilers, more of that to come. But that's not how all of God's people saw it at the time. For in looking at the promises of God and the work of his providence in every action, we've overlooked this one major important factor. For the majority of the Israelites, their perspective was not a deepening recognition of God's sovereign providence over their lives. It was a painful toil, a bitter labour under slavery, an agonising submission to genocide at the hands of an unjust ruler. If you and I were there, I doubt we would have had eyes to see the sovereign hand of God keeping its promise. We'd have been more concerned about the whip hand of the slave drivers and the pain of seeing our sons killed. For to many of God's people, the promises seemed unreal, unattainable, unbelievable, because the pain of persecution had blinded them to the truth that God was still working even through their pain. And there's the warning at the beginning of this book to those of us who want to grow in our relationship with God. We'll never deepen our love for God until our eyes are so set on what he promises that we see every aspect of our life as under his providence. It doesn't mean that we'll like the shape that God leads us in our lives necessarily, but we will recognise that God is in control over our lives and begin to understand, even in the painful times, how his priorities are being worked out. So like for us, the need of the Israelites was to deepen their relationship with the Lord. It still remains. God was working with them, although perhaps only the midwives felt any blessing in it. But if we're to grow into faith, God calls us back to depend on those promises and rely no matter what pressure we face. For he is sovereign, and he promises that those who seek him will find him. And indeed, they found him with a vengeance, as we'll see next time.